Folks, this is the Old Schwamb Mill's presentation, Boston Area Buildings with German Immigrant Historical Associations. The presentation tonight is by Ed Gordon of the Old Schwamb Mill, and Ed's experience in both architecture, domestic architecture, and 19th century American life are well known. He's the president of the New England chapter of the Victorian Society of America. And at the Old Schwamb Mill, Ed, for 12 years now, has headed up our programs, including all our art programs, our historical talks, and of course, Ed leads tours and other presentations of the mill for individuals and groups when they arrive. Continuing on ahead with our talk, I'll turn you over to Ed Gordon for a look at the buildings of Boston with German Immigrant Associations. Ed?
Welcome everyone to the Old Schwamb Mill's January lecture program. This evening, the purpose is really twofold: to present an overview of selected buildings in the Boston area, including Arlington, that have associations with German immigrants, and also as a way to place our Schwambs, as in the Charles Schwamb and family that founded the Old Schwamb Mill in 1864, to place them within the context of other innovative Germans who are coming to this country during the period of 1840 to about 1900. So let's see. Why is this not?
I don't know who.
I gotta, move it down.
I don't know. Is that the second slide?
No, that's the second slide.
Okay, I think it was just hung up for a second.
Okay, so we are starting with this painting by the German Romantic artist Caspar David Friedrich called The Wanderer, looking out over the Sea of Fog, that was painted in 1818, showing a German man essentially looking out into the future, or at least that's how I'm interpreting it for the purposes of this talk, just to say that between 1820 and 1880, 2.5 million Germans left Germany, which at that time consisted of Prussia and then the many much smaller German independent states. Germany will be united, all those states, in the 1870s. But the Germans tended, there was just a small group that settled in the Boston area. Most of the Germans that came to this country went out to the Midwest and the northern Midwest. And I think it's fair to say that the ones who stayed in New England and the East Coast, they didn't come here to be farmers. They came here to use their mechanical skills. And as in the case of the Schwambs, they were able to come over here, hit the ground running. Many of them were involved in clock and watch making, in the making of mechanical furniture. They owned and operated restaurants, and the Schwambs, were known for their picture frames and the piano cases that they made. In contrast, the Irish immigrants of the same period. Um, by 1855, Boston had a population of 150,000, 70,000 of which were Irish, and only 4,000 Germans. And it's interesting that half of that 4,000, half were Catholic, half were Protestant. And it's the Irish story that is much more widely known, but the Germans certainly made important contributions to the economy and culture of the Boston area. So the first slide is meant to symbolize Boston on the eve of intensive immigration. This is the 1827 Tremont House Hotel that used to be right to the right of the Granary Burial Ground at the corner of Tremont Street and Beacon Street, and it is considered to be the first modern hotel in North America, modern in the sense that it had a lobby, it had a check-in desk, there were rooms for individual parties and people, not people sharing rooms. It had restaurant, it was pipe for gas. It was really, really modern. So this forward-looking building is kind of looking into the near future. At this point, we're still in the canal age, but we're looking into the railroad age that will start in the mid-1830s, and the railroads play obviously a very important role with the industries involving Germans and others in moving around their products. And the immigrants that are coming here, they're not staying at the Tremont House Hotel. That was, I don't know, Ritz Millennium of its time, but they're ending up in the Irish in the North End in Fort Hill. Fort Hill is where 1-2 International Place rises today over on High Street. The Germans tended to immigrate to the area just to the south of Stewart Street, the Stewart Street Neeland area in the theater district. Both immigrant groups, many of them are starting out in very inferior residential situations. Here you see a painting called The Poor Poet by the German artist Karl Spitzweg. And yes, it's in Germany, but I'm using it here to stand for the immigrant beginnings. And then this is the first hot air balloon aerial view of downtown Boston that was shot in 1860, looking down at this very crowded city with at the kind of center left, you can just see the spire of the steeple of the Old South Meeting House. And so these immigrants are moving in and pushing long-time, typically Protestant families out of their neighborhoods. And here is an engraving dating from 1844 showing the Boston and Providence Railroad coming in over the unfilled marshes of the Back Bay, heading towards the first kind of makeshift Park Square Railroad station that they had in the beginning. And this Boston and Providence Railroad will be very important to the Germans who moved out into the Stony Brook Valley of Roxbury, the Roxbury Highlands, and Jamaica Plain and West Roxbury, allowing the moving around of goods and also serving passengers. And so the Germans tended to settle very near the Park Square, what was a railroad terminal, until the 1920s, when the Park Square station was taken down to make way for the Park Plaza Hotel. And so this is Boston in 1850, the original Shawmut Peninsula that the Puritans first settled in 1630. It's beginning to fill out as the result of landfill to the east and west. And then here is the neighborhood just below the Boston Common, which is where the Germans tended to settle. Yes, along Stewart and Neeland, originally called Elliott Street, but to the south in sort of a little bit into the Bay Village area, not a very big area. And so the first building is a remnant of this once vibrant German community, the Jacob Wirth Company restaurant, which sadly closed in 2018, founded in 1868. This is a restaurant that survived 2 world wars that had anti-German feeling in this country associated with that. It survived the Depression, so this closed a couple of years before the pandemic, but its fate, I think, is somewhat in the balance. Yes, both the exterior and the interior are National Register and Boston interior landmarks, but it'll be interesting to see what happens with this double row house that was built in 1844. And then actually Jacob Wirth Company started out across the street, moves in here in the 1870s. And Wirth was originally from Rhenish, Prussia, now part of Poland. And his family had an estate, and they had a vineyard, and Wirth wine was served in this building. So this is, a physical link to that now lost German community in the downtown, in the theater district. And so now we're moving from the theater district into the South End. And this is actually looking east along Washington Street, a watercolor of 1814. Off to the left, you can see Beacon Hill with the State House on top there and the unfilled Back Bay. On the right foreground is a double townhouse that was built in 1806 and remarkably still there to this day. And the point here is that this narrow neck of land that linked Boston with the mainland and Roxbury would soon be filled in on either side, so that these immigrant populations can be accommodated, particularly the Germans. Now, the oldest Schwamb brother, Jacob, is the first brother of 6 to come to America. He does so in the late 1830s, and this is one of the first places that he works, the Hallett and Cumston Piano Forte Manufactory. And this is a high-end, high-quality outfit, and I think it speaks to Jacob's skills as a woodworker that he could get a job here practically, right off the dock. the building, long since torn down early 20th century, essentially a circular kind of a drum of a building. And then behind it was the German neighborhood of Eastern Shawmut Avenue and Bradford Street. And then here's actually a fine example of housing built by and for Germans. This is Shawmut Avenue, corner of Waltham Street, showing a group from 1852 built by German bricklayer brothers from Aachen, Germany. And so you see the kind of stepped curving gables that speak to kind of more low country, Netherlands, Belgium, et cetera, architecture. And then this is to say that a block away is the South End that I think most of us are think about or are familiar with, the South End that's all about these Beaufront row houses. This is Union Park, one of the 6 residential so-called squares, but they had oval parks that were spread out through what was essentially a grid plan neighborhood. So this is not part of the German story. This is the kind of the new wealth coming in the 1850s and 60s, but the Germans are not too far away. And then this is the Zion Evangelical Lutheran Church of 1842 to 47, that as it turns out, this was the early Schwamb's church. This was Jacob and his brother Leopold, and his brother Frederick was married here in 1857. The Schwambs, even after they moved to Arlington, still maintain a link with this. And Jacob was a co-founder of this church and was a kind of a lay reader who filled in for the pastor when he was traveling to other congregations. So this is very simple, beautifully simple, rectangular, boxy brick, pedimented, very Greek Revival. And interestingly, this building has been vacant since at least 1970. And when I was out here taking photographs the other day, I saw building department permits in the window. So this is like seeing some kind of a vision that after all these many decades, it looks like something's going to be happening here. But the Sahara sign speaks to the Syrian community that was here from the 19-teens until the 1970s. And it was one of sort of a quartet of Syrian restaurants that were down in this area. And then this is I just wanted to show split granite foundation and then that clean planarity. And moving into the German Catholic experience, this is Holy Trinity Church, more often called the German Church. And this still stands, though, as we will see, it's been converted to condominiums. But it's the church that you see when you're on the Mass Turnpike extension heading towards South Station. And if you look up to the right, you see the church minus the steeple, which blew down in the hurricane of 1938. There was a smaller church at first near this site that lasted from 1844 until the 1870s, and then this church was completed in 1877. And so I think this brings up the fact that the Germans at first, especially the Catholic Germans, had a problem acclimating because they really went to town celebrating Christmas and some of the other holidays. And this is a Boston that still has a little bit of Puritanism still going on. So, and the German Catholics wanted to have a priest that was one of their own that spoke German, and that was hard to supply by the Irish dominated Roman Catholic Church. So it was a rocky beginning. And in fact, the church in the 1840s closed for about 4 years because of the difficulties. And then by the 1870s, this larger church came along. And this is the church, you know, not ruined by fire, but getting ready for the condo conversion in about 2016 or 2017. And then this is the resulting condominium complex of 33 units, now called the Lucas because it was named after a long lost street that used to be in the area. I think it's important to point out that this church was right next door to what was called the New York Streets neighborhood, which is considered the first really new, densely settled, immigrant-oriented neighborhood in the city. So this is the last building, the last old building from that area that's now known as the Ink Block neighborhood, where the Herald newspaper used to be published out of. And so now we're moving west into Roxbury, and it's so interesting that most of the Germans in Boston, you know, not our Schwambs who went north into Arlington, but most of the Germans headed due west, a straight shot into Roxbury, Jamaica Plain, West Roxbury. And this happens to be the Louis Prang chromolithograph factory on Elliott Street in Roxbury, very close to the Roxbury Crossing Orange Line T station. Elliott Street leads up to the 1804 Elliott Church. Okay, so this is where Prang had his highly successful, internationally known chromolithographic business. And he's found a cheap way to mass produce art historical reproductions, as well as greeting cards. Prang was considered to be the father of the Christmas card. The first Christmas cards in the US are published out of here in 1875. He's coming from Germany, born in the 1820s, coming from a calico printing background in Germany. And then he gets into map making. His first success was in the 1860s, making maps that showed Civil War battle sites, battlefields. And then in the 1870s, he starts to get into chromolithography, a form of lithography. He hires, interestingly, a small army of women to be the artists who will color in to do the colors involved in what's being depicted. And he's also an early proponent of making art an important part of public education. So he's in the forefront of a lot of things. And he's in this, you know, out of this building from 1873 to 1890. And then he moves on into other ventures. And then this is an example of one of his Christmas cards. Looks pretty spring-like with a rose. That's he liked the rose. His wife's name was Rosa. But these started out as business cards. And somebody said, well, these would make good Christmas cards. So that's how that began. And then now we're moving into across the Stony Brook Valley from where the Prang factory is, no longer serving that purpose, but where it is, into the Mission Hill neighborhood. And this was a very German area in the 1860s, 70s into the early 80s. And that is because the breweries, the famous German breweries of the Stony Brook Valley, a waterway that rises in Hyde Park and will eventually go through the Back Bay Fens over behind the Museum of Fine Arts and the Fenway and the Fens, and then empty into the Charles River. So, so the Stony Brook water is great for brewing. At that time, it was clean and pure. And there were no fewer than somewhere around 25 breweries in this Mission Hill, Jamaica Plain, West Roxbury area. And this is an example of workers' houses from 1859 that actually relate to the Sewell Day Cordage Company, rope making company, which was about where the Wentworth Institute is today. And there were some Germans who lived in here. When I encountered this group in the mid 80s, when I was doing a Mission Hill survey, this was freestanding. It wasn't like now where it's sort of built into the side of new apartments, but there are 3 groups of these buildings in the neighborhood. They're really interesting to see. And then the Mission Church, yes, heavily identified with the Irish community, that comes later, but it has its roots in the 1870s with Catholic Germans. And this is on Tremont Street, getting somewhat close to Huntington Avenue and the Longwood Medical area. This was a church that started out as a modest wooden building on the site. It was, and I believe still is run by the Redemptorist Fathers. This was a group that started out in the East Village of New York City, and their primary purpose was to reach out to the poor and the working poor in urban communities. And the Mission Church here, yes, that was part of their mission, but this church was originally meant for these German priests to fan out into New England and even Canada. It was a sort of a home base. And then by the late 1880s, the Irish group had pretty much firmly taken over. But the church itself was built between 1876 and 1878 by a firm called Schinkel and Ditmars of New York City. And Schinkel was born in Germany. Ditmars was German, but born in Nova Scotia. And they specialized in churches and hospitals. Lenox Hill Hospital in Manhattan started out as the German hospital in the late 19th century. And so this church is renowned for its remarkable collection of Munich stained glass, and really the top providers of Munich glass. And that would be Francis Xavier Zettler and Franz Mayer. And this Munich glass, the kind of characteristic is the panes of glass are like not small pieces of glass that have leaded surrounds. They're larger expanses of glass with more in the way of painting. And this is a stained glass school, if you will, that was influenced by the renewed interest in Renaissance painting and kind of copying biblical scenes from the old masters like Masaccio and Michelangelo, and especially Raphael. And there's so much that can be said about this remarkable church that it was declared a basilica in 1954, which is a high honor, which is kind of, it's recognized, I think I'm getting this right, that when the Pope visits the Boston area, he comes here first. It's some close tie to the papacy. And also in more recent times, it's where Senator Edward M. Kennedy's funeral took place. And that was because he would come here when he was visiting family members who were sick in the medical area of the Fenway. And it's just a really, and it was also called the Lords of New England. It was called the Church of Miracle Cures, and the famous stories of the lobby with the piled up crutches and braces and people feeling like they've been made well by their worshiping here. And so here is a close-up of the front of the church on Tremont Street. The towers date to 2010. I'm not to 2010, to 1910. And interestingly, also designed by a German architect named Franz Josef Untersee, who, before coming to the Boston area in 1882, was the city planner for the city of Bern, Switzerland. And so he came here primarily as a city planner, but he somehow picked up architectural skills. And by 1910, he's providing these towers. He designed churches in Brighton, commercial buildings. So these are the twin spires that you see when you're coming out of the Huntington Avenue entrance of the MFA Boston, and you're looking off to the right, to the west. And these spires are very much apparent with an octagonal cupola over the crossing within the sanctuary, 215 feet above the floor of the sanctuary. And then this is a postcard view of the Mission Church. Its official name is the Our Lady of Perpetual Help. And this is the church in 1907 without the towers. So much more severe looking, much less perhaps compelling or dramatic, however you want to put it. And so moving along on Mission Hill. Mission Hill, it should be said, started out in colonial times, known as Parker Hill for the colonial era family of John Parker, who had extensive apple orchards on this hill, the hill that has New England Baptist Hospital on the top of it. And this is going up Parker Street with an early 1890s, what started out as a German Lutheran church, later Presbyterian. But of interest here is the fact that a German architect is designing this, Jacob Leupold, who's, I think his claim to fame was more in the way of his very well-designed three-decker row houses, frankly, from the late 19th century. But here we have a brick Victorian Gothic church, and just peeking out off to the left is what started out as a congregational Sunday school in 1857, and by the 1880s is, a place for the Lutherans to worship. It was in fact called Luther Hall. And then getting into the brewery story a bit, this was the home of the Pfaff family, Henry and Jacob Pfaff, the brothers who who owned and operated the Pfaff Brewing Company down at Roxbury Crossing, where Roxbury Community College is today. And this is a house of Italianate mansard house of the late 1850s, only about 10 years into the rage for the mansard style that will last into the early 1880s, so it's very up to date. so this speaks to the prosperous lifestyle available to a brewer. And then here is the wonderful advertisement for H&J Pfaff of Boston. And, all of these buildings, the Pfaff buildings are gone, but happily the Hafenreffer brewery that we'll see shortly is very intact and can tell that story of the 25 plus breweries in the Stony Brook Valley, can tell it very well. And then moving on, getting into Jamaica Plain and the Eggleston Square area. This was the home of, it's on Amory Street, right near the Stony Brook Orange Line station. And it was built in the late 1860s for a man who lists himself as a cigar dealer in downtown Boston, Washington Street. And he, what he sold, he listed as cigars, newspapers, and sundries. And so you've got, somewhat unusual in this sea of wooden buildings to have a brick Italianate, fairly substantial, from just after the Civil War. And then getting into Hafenreffer. The Hafenreffer brewery starts in 1871, and with the exception of Prohibition from 1920 to 1932, it will be in business until as late as 1965, but limping along by the 60s. And then there is a period from 65 to 85 where there's very little going on here. And in 1985, Bill Koch, or Koch, I think it's Koch, steps in and revisits the Boston Beer Company. This is a historic beer company name that actually dates to 1827, but it was the name was revived by Koch, and this is where to this day Sam Adams beer is brewed. And there is a wonderful tour, not so much these days, but coming back shortly, hopefully, and a place to have lunch and a kind of a casual dinner. And it's a collection of a half a dozen or more buildings set within a system of streets that all have German names: Germania, Bismarck, Liszt, Mozart, Bismarck. And it really gives you a much fuller picture in a part of the city that has sort of remnants of breweries surviving, but not virtually the entire thing. And the big gable roof buildings that we're seeing here, this is where the main brewing process took place. The Hafenreffers are, I wouldn't say they're introducing lager beer to the city, but they're jumping on that bandwagon. And you see on the left, the Hafenreffer smokestack goes down to the boiler room. That had to be repainted in recent times, but it's a fascinating place to visit. Here is the Treasurer's Building, looking less vernacular and more formal, kind of a panel brick style building. And then Jamaica Plain artists have gotten involved, providing murals that speak to the history and speak to folks that live there presently. And then we have an example of a German music club that had a short life as a music club. This is on Amory Street, getting close to the Green Street T-stop on the Orange Line. It was built in 1894. Don't know the name of the architect, but it had a short life as a music club. There were several of these clubs in Jamaica Plain. And I should just point out that there was uh, quite a German culture here with several German language newspapers, German taught in the schools. Um, they really kept their culture alive in the late 19th century until World War I, until 1917, when there was, if you were a German, there was a tendency to kind of step away from your culture, if you will. And so, what we have here is a building that very quickly turned into the Jamaica Plain Settlement House, which was a place where immigrants in the community could come and learn English, and there was a daycare component, and it was really a place and really run by the Protestant ladies of Sumner Hill across the valley to try to give these immigrants a leg up in the Boston area. And it's just such an extraordinary building, with the pilasters that appear between the windows, the first floor treated like a vertical stack of coins, and then the arched windows speaking to the Renaissance revival that the Germans gravitated to. Here's a detail of this extraordinary high relief kind of stucco detail, bunches of grapes and vines, and with panels above that are showcasing different musical instruments. Just an amazing survival. And then this is sort of a farewell to the Hoffenreffer company. And I should say that the Hoffenreffer family, they were great philanthropists. They donated a museum of anthropology to a town in Rhode Island whose name is escaping me at the moment. They also donated money to rejuvenate the Boston Public Garden. That's where the Hoffenreffer Walk is. And then now we're heading north and west to Arlington, to the Arlington piece of this talk. This is the Theodore Schwamb Mill at 1171 Mass Avenue near Forest Street. And I think this is appropriate for this to come first, because in this collection of buildings, this is where at least 5 of the Schwamb brothers worked together in the 1850s before they ended up having mills and woodworking concerns of their own. But the complex starts off as the Paul F. Dodge Woodworking Company that dates to about 1840. And our Charles Schwamb started working here as early as 1848. And so, this is what came before the Old Schwamb Mill, in a sense. And over on the left, there's a very Greek revival mill building from the 1840s that comes from the Dodge era, with many additions added. This is behind the Myrack Hyundai dealership. And I have to say the Myrack family has been wonderful stewards of these buildings that they own. They're illuminated at night. The maintenance is great. And then here is another look over on the right. You can see the Theodore Schwamb name, painted on the side of the 1906 building that's behind the wooden building here. The Theodore Schwamb Company really begins in the early 1870s, and it will last into the early 1970s. And it's, it was all about making the furniture aspect of pianos, the piano cases. By the 1920s, there was a need to switch from piano making because the radio had come into vogue. And so the parlor pastime was now listening to the radio, not gathering around the piano. And so they're adaptable. And in 1928, even though the ownership leaves the Schwamb family, um, the Theodore Schwamb name is retained, wisely retained. And then from 28 onward, this complex is making ornamental woodwork for churches, for historic restorations like Tryon Place in New Bern, North Carolina, total recreation of a royal governor's mansion. The original paneling for the Clarendon Street John Hancock building, 1923, made by this company. And then this is the 1906 building, which speaks to, the great prosperity they were enjoying at that point in the early 1900s. And you can see on the right the Mill Brook, looking more like a canal with the concrete walls, but that is the brook. Unlike the Stony Brook in Boston, which is now totally in a culvert and unseeable, in Arlington, you can see, I forget what the percentage is, maybe you can see 40% of this brook, and it's important to be able to have that visual to understand the history. This was originally the Paul F. Dodge House of the 1840s, right in front of the factory complex. This is where Theodore Schwamb will then move after Dodge. And originally there was an encircling veranda, open porch on two sides. But you see the Greek Revival shining through there in the Doric pilasters, the pedimented attic. And then we have the Charles Schwamb, our Schwamb, Charles Schwamb's house at 22 Fessenden Street, with behind it the nearly identical stable, which is now a separate residence. And this was built about 1870 in the Italian mansard style. This will be the scene in 1875 of Charles William Schwamb, the son, agreeing to go into the family business, even though he is more of a musician than a businessman by all accounts, and would much rather be playing in local orchestras than minding the store at the mill, but he does do that. And so this was the Schwamb homestead. And then here is our Schwamb Mill, which we'll come back to at the very end, but built in 3 stages, 1861, 1869 to 73 at left, and the 1880s at right. And so the center back part of our building is the ready-made, intended for a spice grinding mill structure that the Woodbridge Mill never moved in there. And so the Schwambs move in 1864 with this ready-made factory building. They proceed to build out U-shaped complex where Mill Pond Park is today, over at the near right. What was it? Was a mill pond that was part of a sophisticated water delivery system. Come to the mill, take a tour when we reopen to get the lowdown on that. And then moving to Mount Gilboa, Crescent Hill, very interesting neighborhood. The northern sort of component of Arlington Heights. Perhaps the better known southern half is where the water tower, classical revival water tower, rises atop Pierce's Hill. This, I think, is the lesser known, but deserves to be better known neighborhood that is characterized by a still kind of a rustic, rock outcroppings, not unlike Mission Hill in Roxbury in topographically. This is a neighborhood where there is an attempt in the 1870s to get this neighborhood off the ground, and it's not until the 1880s when it starts to take hold, thanks to a then new cooperative banking concept where it was like the homeowners were owning shares in this development, and it could be, the houses could be lived in by true middle class people who worked for newspapers and were wood carvers and builders, and then here we have the home of Johannes Kirschmeyer, the great Bavarian wood carver who did a lot of church work with Ralph Adams Cram, famously, and was from Omaramago. I'm probably murdering the pronunciation of that, but from the town in Bavaria that's famous for its passion plays, its biblical reenactments that occur every 10 years. And it is thought that because he grew up in the midst of a town noted for its pageantry and wood carving, that he absorbed that. Born in 1860, comes to the US around, I think actually in 1880. He just has this remarkable facility for carving reredos screens at altars and all kind of church-related wood carving. And he will live here in the 1890s into the early 1900s. And then, interestingly, I'm not quite sure why, but he moves from here to East Cambridge, which at that time was a kind of a rough neighborhood, frankly, and he continues his woodworking career over there. But this is a handsome example of a Queen Anne style residence with handsome porch with punched and cut decoration. And there's a kind of an anecdote about Kirschmeyer trying to do woodworking in the kitchen while his wife was trying to cook, and that didn't go over terribly well. But he has family, as it turns out, living in the neighborhood, not far away. This is Crescent Hill Avenue. And this is an example of his wood carving from the Unity Church in northeastern Massachusetts, from 1890, I believe. And then this was the home of his younger half-brother, named Adelbert Zwink, Z-W-I-N-K. And ironically, this is the only building in this talk that looks directly to Germanic design. All the other buildings that we've seen fall in line with styles popular at the time in the US, but this is described as being of a Bavarian chalet style that was designed by Kirschmeyer himself, which, as it turns out, may be the only building designed by Kirschmeyer. And inside, over the mantle, is a low relief, sculptural relief by Kirschmeyer that shows a tall ship being tossed around on rough seas, and whether that speaks to, the immigrant crossing or what, I don't know, but it's it's a house of 1913, and it's just when you're taking a walk up that way and come upon this, it raises all kinds of questions. But to have a Kirschmeyer connection is really extraordinary. And then returning to the Old Schwamb Mill, this is just to urge you that when we reopen, hopefully in the not too distant future, please come and have a tour of our shop floor, of our history room, frame showroom. We've continued the making of frames here as it's been done since 1864 on machinery from the mid-19th to mid-20th centuries. We have a fantastic art exhibit in our art galleries in the spirit of the Dutch Golden Age, the photography of Brian McGuire, available through June 26th. And I thank you all very much for tuning into this, and hope to see you live at the mill in the not too distant future. Thank you.
Ed, thanks very much. Will you have time for some questions tonight? Ed.
Yeah.
Let's see if we have any from folks. You may want to release your screen share so that we can see everybody.
Okay.
Oh.
This. Stop share.
And some people are putting their questions in by way of the comments, which is also fine. Where is the Kirschmeyer building, Ed?
It's at 109 Crescent Hill Avenue.
And the address of the Zwink House?
Is at 79 Crescent Hill Avenue.
Excellent. And if there's any other people who want to raise your hand or something for a question, or you can unmute yourself actually if you like, and ask Ed anything you may have in mind. I know for myself, Ed, we were examining that stuff that's on the walls of the mill.
Yep.
One of the things was the brewery ad for a brewery that was in that
I
same.
think that's the Highland Springs Brewery.
Yeah, and was that in that section or not?
Yeah, it was in the Mission Hill, sort of moving into the JP section. One of the partners was German in that brewery.
I also discovered just this weekend that the Schwamb cousins used to have a kind of annual picnic on Mount Gilboa. So all the different Schwamb cousins, so the second generation from the generation that actually came over here, as they grew up in the 1870s and 80s, used to get together, probably as young adults really, in Mount Gilboa for a picnic sometime during the summer.
How many breweries were there in Boston at the high point, and were there any?
31 with most in that Stony Brook Valley, but there were several in South Boston.
Nothing in Arlington?
No, sadly.
Well, it may come.
Yep. Well, we have the beer garden story that's been unfolding in recent years. The Aeronaut Brewery of Somerville that holds forth at our Oktoberfests, and then has been featured in Whittemore Park in front of the Dahlin Museum before the pandemic. So we do in recent times have a beer garden story.
It's a beginning.
Yep.
I'm looking to see if there's any other questions. You can just unmute yourselves, I think, if you want to raise one. Ed, do you know if there's going to be any uh, sort of similar type of establishment going into where Jake Wirth's building is? And
Well, this is the thing where there's a deafening silence since 2018 as to what's going to happen to that. And the interior is landmarked, which it's kind of like double protection. It's not just the exterior. And the interior is landmarked because there is this amazing, heavily carved Renaissance revival bar and shelving system from about 1890. And it's so intact in there. The
oh, Ed, we've got just a little bit of a hang up, I think, on the in your connection. I'm sure that it's going to work itself out, folks, as it always does. I should say, too, that whole Mount Gilboa area was sort of known for a lot of German settling, and also around the area of the Theodore Schwamb Mill and the Old Schwamb Mill. Quite a lot of the first generation of Schwamb employees were German speakers and Germans and immigrants. And Forest Street was one area that was settled by them, and the area around the Theodore Schwamb complex as well. The Bitzers were there, the Erlenvines. There was a Gottlieb Stingel who came to town, where some of the Schwambs employees stayed boarded when they first would come to town in the 1860s. And John Frederick Bitzer, who was at the mill for a long time, was on Forest Street up until the 1920s when he passed away. And Reed, I'm not sure if we've got Ed coming back or if you can bring him in yourself. Just checking to see here. Ed and Reed are actually at the same location tonight, so they would both be on the same internet. I do see one question. Did the Schwambs lead the way for the Germans in Arlington? I think that they came in along with a fair number of other German immigrants and families who came to Arlington and started working there in the late 1840s and throughout the 1850s. By the 1850s, the Schwambs, all the brothers are working here, but so were a lot of other Germans as well. And one place where they found an end to public service was the fire department, or rather the fire brigades that would form around these engines. And the Eureka is just one of those engines, but the Schwambs were early members of all of those separate fire units, and stayed one generation after another in those fire units as the town eventually took them over. And of course, eventually taking part in the town life as well. There didn't seem to be any resistance to them as newcomers or anything like that. They were encouraged to run for school committee and other things Jacob Bitzer eventually became representative for Arlington in the Mass legislature. Hi, Ed.
Hi, I'm seeing a question from Stroker about did any Germans in Arlington ever open a restaurant in town? And, I can tell you that in the late 19th century, there was a German hotel on the east side of Spy Pond, on a point that projected out into Spy Pond. And it became infamous for its boisterous beer garden, singing and carrying on. And that didn't sit well with people in town, and interesting because the near neighbors were market garden farmers who, were not close together. They were widely spaced farmhouses and lots of open fields. So I don't quite know why this hotel was shut down in the mid 1890s. But there was a German hotel, and people came out on the train and stayed for a week or a month in the summertime.
The mills must have made use of the railroad? running
Yes,
on the bike path? Can you talk about that a bit?
Yes, both in Arlington, obviously in the Millbrook Valley, the Lexington, and originally West Cambridge Railway. Yes, the railroad was huge in helping those mills to thrive and survive. Yes.
So
Theodore Schwamb had his own siding for his mill eventually.
He had a spur track that went up from the mill to that railway.
Yeah, whereas the Schwambs had to get their own goods from the regular stop the freight trains would make.
who had the spur track?
The Theodore Schwamb Mill.
And is there any remnant of that?
No, it's all parking lots. And a landscaping company.
Interesting.
That Theodore company remained fairly modest until probably the later 1890s, I think, Ed. I mean, up until then, it was like a sort of similar in size to the Schwamb Mill, I think.
Yes, and then they had that burst of building activity in the early 1900s.
I think that Arlington Coal had their own siding, and the mill was a few hundred yards away. It wouldn't surprise me if they bought material a carload at a time, if they trucked it down from, by truck, by horse, either from the Theodore Schwamb or from Arlington Coal.
Yeah, I think also I remember talking to one of the Larsons who came by to the mill, and he said that he developed some way of more efficiently getting goods from the rail to the Schwamb Mill in what would have been the 20th century, mid 20th, I guess. So, the ornate former music club in Roxbury. What is that now, Ed? Do you know?
I don't know if it's called the Jamaica Plain Settlement House still, but it still has a kind of a daycare youth mission.
Talking just a bit about the Inn on Spy Pond, the issue of whether Arlington should be closed to alcohol or not was a big one in the late 19th and early 20th century.
Well, actually that alcohol ban grew out of that hotel experience.
Yeah.
We can thank that hotel for that long drought that only stopped when, around 2000?
Carl William, I think, was involved in different, in his church performances. He also was the musical director for the Sunday schools, but also gave at least one concert in behalf of one of the temperance unions. I think the WCTU actually in the late. So different people probably had adopted one or the other stance on the alcohol. So
there must have been breweries in Cambridge, though, next door.
Well,
how far did you have to go to buy beer in quantity?
Well, maybe to South Boston would be the closest. I'm not, Sarah, I see you're on here. You're with the Cambridge Historical Commission. Were there breweries in Cambridge, East Cambridge, for example?
No, Cambridge was dry even earlier than Arlington, and it came out of it sooner, but no breweries that I've.
When did it go dry, Cambridge?
Oh, in the 1870s.
And what was going on then that dried up everyone?
I think it was mostly a social movement. No German hotels to blame for that one.
Hmm.
Do you think that was Carrie Nation and Company, the the Connecticut Coldwater Army or whatever they were called, having an impact on Cambridge?
Right. I think it was probably a reaction to waves of immigration and the more puritanical people who were welcoming them in shut off the taps, but we didn't have a Carrie Nation of our own. There were liquor raids and things in the teens, and got written up in the newspapers, but no hatchets.
There were, Ed and I have both looked in the Arlington Advocate over the years, and there were regular arrests for alcohol in either making it or bringing it into Arlington among different families in town who almost became notorious for having it available at their house, maybe as kind of an informal inn or bar or something like that. Well into the 1860s, 1870s, 1880s. So
they'd have to go well into Boston to pick it up.
well, they could have also been making it too, I suppose. I mean, you could certainly make beer at home.
Well, I tried it. I don't recommend mine.
and wine making was happening too.
Yeah.
Not very good wine.
Jacob Wirth survived Prohibition by serving near beer, which was real low alcohol content. And they somehow got away with that.
Yeah, I remember having dinner at that restaurant as a student.
Yep.
There was also a Schützenfest that was held once that I have read about down on Spy Pond. And it drew people from all over the Boston area, people of German backgrounds and heritage.
When was that?
I think it was the 1870s that I saw it. Again, Arlington newspaper. So I don't know if it happened year after year or not. I think outside groups Ed could rent that spot by Spy Pond. So any sort of group of affiliated people could meet there, and you might draw people from all over New England even, or certainly the Boston area. So then you'd have big crowds to contend with.
Right.
Well, they obviously got a liquor permit.
And Ed, there's another question from Sarah. What is the ornate? Yeah, you've already mentioned this. The Ornate Former Music Club in Roxbury now.
Yeah.
I think you already did answer that one.
Yeah.
So I think if there are no other questions, then we'll call this a wrap. Definitely appreciate you all coming. We'll have this recorded and on the website fairly shortly.
Oh, good.
And then in addition, we will be having like another talk live, I believe. February 28th, is it, Ed?
25th.
25th.
Yeah.
And you might want to talk about that for just a second.
Yep. So the talk on February 25th will be about the current photography show in the mill. And, this is work by the late photographer Brian McGuire. And his widow Louise and I will be going through and talking about his, they lived in Belgium for about 10 years, and they love to go around to museums in the Netherlands and Belgium, and they became very hooked on 16th century Dutch still life painting. And so it's kind of talking about that influence on his magnificent still life photography. And so I think it'll be a very interesting talk.
It'll also include many of the artworks that are on the
Oh,
walls.
absolutely. Yeah. Selected artworks. Yep.
So it's a way to see the exhibit now,
Yeah.
and then hopefully come and visit later when we're open in
Yeah.
possibly warmer weather, maybe March or something. Okay, very good. Well, thanks everyone for coming tonight, and thank you, Ed, for your talk.
Well,
And
thank you
for all those
and
buildings.
Reed Schneider for all the technical assistance. Thank you so much.
Okay,
And-
thank you.
And folks, thanks very much again for all the support you've given us this year while we've been closed
Thank you.
for much of the year. So thanks
Thank
to
you.
all the Schwamb family here.
Thank you. Great program.
Thank you. Good to
Thank
see
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.